Why does Wharton contrast the different yards outside Mrs. Manstey's window? In this lesson, you will learn how to determine why the text leaves matters unclear by analyzing contrasting images. We have been doing a close reading of Mrs. Manstey's View by Edith Wharton. In the story, we have two characters, Mrs. Manstey and Mrs. Black, who are very different. Mrs. Manstey is part of the lower class. Mrs. Black is a landlady, thus putting her in the upper class. Mrs. Manstey does not want Mrs. Black to build her extension because it will ruin Mrs. Manstey's view. Mrs. Black is all business. She needs the extension so that she can have more tenants, thus making more money. Another difference between the two is that Mrs. Manstey believes that she actually persuaded Mrs. Black to stop the construction. Mrs. Black, however, is merely humoring Mrs. Manstey because she thinks Mrs. Manstey is crazy. Through all this conflict, I'm still left wondering, why is the view so important? There has to be more to it. Mrs. Manstey must have a deeper connection to the view than what is stated in the text. That is why analyzing the contrasting views of the different yards is so important. So when we are trying to determine why the text leaves matters unclear, we're going to follow these three steps. First, we're going to highlight the contrasting images in the passage. Next, we're going to ask, what does the author want me to recognize about these contrasts? And third, we're going to ask, what bigger message is the author trying to convey through these contrasts? We are going to focus our attention on page 2. We will be looking at the first two paragraphs on the page because this is the first time that Wharton thoroughly describes what Mrs. Manstey likes and dislikes about the view outside of her window. Here is the first paragraph. We are going to highlight the contrasting images. Now, because we've already read the story at least one time through already, we know that in this first paragraph she talks about one yard, and in the other paragraph she describes the other yard. So we aren't going to see contrasting images in this single paragraph. However, we do see this statement, these yards Mrs. Manstey disapproved of. This has a very negative connotation or implication. For that reason, we know that this paragraph has negative descriptions, while the other paragraph will have positive ones. So, we are going to highlight all of the negative images. But of greater interest were the yards beyond. Being for the most part attached to boarding houses, they were in a state of chronic untidiness and fluttering on certain days of the week with miscellaneous garments and frayed tablecloths. So when she looks out of her window, she sees the boarders' laundry blowing in the wind. This is not something most people would want to see when they look outside. In spite of this, Mrs. Manstey found much to admire in the long vista which she commanded. Some of the yards were indeed but stony wastes, with grass in the cracks of the pavements and no shade in the spring save the afforded by the intermittent leafage of the clotheslines. This says that some of the yards were all rocks and concrete that was not maintained properly, thus allowing the grass to grow in between the cracks. And then it says that there was no shade. This implies that there are no trees, and we know how much Mrs. Manstey loves looking at the magnolia tree in the yard. These yards Mrs. Manstey disapproved of, but the others, the green ones, she loved. She had grown used to their disorder. The broken barrels, the empty bottles, and the paths unswept no longer annoyed hers. Hers was the happy faculty of dwelling on the pleasanter side of the prospect before her. All right, I'm also going to highlight broken barrels, empty bottles, and paths unswept. It seems like none of the boarders care about the appearance because they leave barrels and bottles laying around. I can definitely see why she doesn't like this view. Now let's look at the second paragraph. We are going to highlight the images that contrast the ones in the previous paragraph. In the very next enclosure did not a magnolia open its hard white flowers against the watery blue of April. Here we have a mention of the magnolia, which is different from the paragraph above, which implied that there were no trees. Also, look at the language, hard white flowers and watery blue of April. This is far more poetic than the previous paragraph. You have light colors such as white and blue, which give off a calming feeling. Unlike the previous passage, this one has a very positive connotation. And was there not, a little way down the line, a fence foamed over every May be lilac waves of wisteria? This still is very poetic and beautiful. It is a vastly different image from the cracked pavement with grass growing in between the cracks. Farther still, a horse chestnut lifted its candelabra of buff and pink blossoms above the broad fans of foliage, while in the opposite yard June was sweet with the breath of neglected syringa which persisted in growing in spite of the countless obstacles opposed to its welfare. Okay, so this image of the candelabra of branches holding up the pink blossoms on the tree is very pleasing to the eye. And the syringa, which persisted in growing in spite of the countless obstacles opposed to its welfare, well, here we have a plant that is able to grow even through obstacles that try to get in its way. This has a very positive connotation. So after highlighting the contrasting images, we are ready to move on to step 2 and ask ourselves, what does the author want me to recognize about these contrasts? I'm going to use a sticky note to keep track of my ideas. The first thing I noticed is the juxtaposition. Remember, juxtaposition is the act of placing contrasts side by side, and Wharton is clearly contrasting the ugly yards with the pretty yards. The next thing I want to note is both types of the yards are visible from Mrs. Manstey's window. The paragraphs are organized by location. The uglier yards are closer than the pretty ones. The ugly yards belong to the boarding houses, which consist of lower class people. Another thing I notice is that there are no trees in the ugly yards, and the pretty yards have lush greenery. So now that I've jotted down what I think are the important contrasts, I can now move on to step 3 and ask myself, what bigger message is the author trying to convey through these contrasts? When I look back at my sticky note, the section about who the ugly yards belong to really stands out to me. Wirt makes it very clear in the first paragraph that the ugly yards belong to the boarding houses. She doesn't make any indication to the social class of those who own the pretty yards, but I can infer that because the ugly yards belong to the lower class residents, that the pretty yards belong to the upper class. So I think one of the big points Wharton is trying to make is that in the 19th century, there are stark differences between the upper and lower classes. When Wharton is explaining the pretty yards, the language is almost poetic. Mrs. Manstey is able to overlook the ugly yards just to focus on the pretty ones. It is this view that she is willing to do anything to keep. I think Wharton is giving us more insight into Mrs. Manstey's character. She's not just a crazy old lady who is willing to commit arson to save the view from her window. I think Mrs. Manstey focuses on the pretty yards because she wants to be part of this elite social class. It makes sense. At the end of the story, the other boarders in Mrs. Manstey's building feel like she gave off a vibe that indicated that she was better than everyone else, and that snobbish trait is often associated to rich people. So looking out onto those yards allows her to escape her situation and become someone she could never really be. So I'm starting to see past the delusional side of Mrs. Manstey and really see her as a sad old lady who really has nothing to live for but an illusion of a life she will never obtain. And by focusing on uncertain parts of the text and really looking at the contrasts in front of us, we are able to recognize just how important word choice is on the text as a whole. So when we are trying to determine why the text leaves matters unclear by analyzing contrasting images, there are 3 steps we should follow. First, highlight the contrasting images in the passage. Second, ask, what does the author want me to recognize about these contrasts? And third, ask, what bigger message is the author trying to convey through these contrasts? In this lesson, you have learned how to determine why the text leaves matters unclear by analyzing contrasting images.